Did you know that in winemaking there are two types of yield that can have significant impact on the quality of wine? The first type of yield happens in the vineyard, and this is dealing with the number of tons of fruit that can come off a hectare of vines. For example, in South Africa, in a fertile valley like the Viticulture, a commercial producer who perhaps is not particularly quality conscious may farm in such a way as to get up to 40 tons of fruit per hectare of vine. Now, on the other end of the scale, you might have some crazy 70-year-old bush vine that is growing at high altitudes, and it might only yield 3 or 4 tons of fruit in the same area of land. Really, what we're talking about here is the variable cost of producing a ton of fruit. And it's also worth noting that in the case of bush vines, farming them is almost always more expensive because the odd shape of the vines makes the sort of automated machinery activity in the vineyards almost impossible. But Han, why would you bother? I hear all the accountants screaming. And I guess the rebuttal from dreamy, idealistic winemakers all over the world would be that, generally speaking, when you farm in such a way as to reduce yields or have an older set of vines that naturally have lower yields, the juice that is produced will be more concentrated and more intense, and ultimately end up producing wines that are complex, layered and textured, and hopefully would deliver a better price per bottle of wine in a retail setting. The second type of yield, which almost never gets talked about, takes place in the cellar. And in this instance, we're talking about the yield of juice, or the recovery that a winemaker can get per ton of fruit. So without doing anything too crazy, your average winemaker should be able to get roughly 700 liters to 750 liters of grape juice out of a ton of grapes. But again, there is the quality versus quantity playoff that occurs. Because if there was a particularly cost-conscious winemaker at work who perhaps wanted to squeeze the grapes for all that they were worth, he might get 820 liters out of a ton of fruit. But it must again be noted that when you squeeze grapes to that level, you're going to be extracting almost everything, which includes some really undesirable, bitter, tannic, phenolic compounds that perhaps you don't want in your wine if you are concerned with quality. Now again, the accountants among us might applaud the laudable efficiency displayed by the first winemaker who gets 120 liters out of his ton of fruit. But again, the hope on the other end of the spectrum is that the more gentle winemaking process may in the end yield a far higher price in that retail setting. Now, the reason that we're talking about various types of yields in the first place is because today's hand drink solo wine of the day is the Olifantsberg Pinotage, which is produced in a very gentle style by only extracting 600 liters per ton of fruit. And so this very gently made wine ends up drinking more like a Pinot Noir than anything else. I've spent much time in the past talking about the Olifantsberg winemaking team, so I'm not going to do more of that now. And in fact, I've left some links to the various videos that I've made on them. But I do think that there are just 3 things that I do need to mention this time around. Number one is that the cellar master and head winemaker Elisme Visser is not just a winemaker. In fact, she is one of South Africa's few genuine vignerons who have the time and the focus to not only oversee everything in the cellar, but also to be in charge of the viticultural team out in the vineyards. The second thing that we need to note is that Elisme's husband, Ferdi Visser, is in his own right an award-winning winemaker. Now, he joined the team in 2021, and he brings with him a superbly geeky, nerdy, details-oriented, granular kind of approach to winemaking, which, when you combine Elisme and Ferdi together, make Olifantsberg the kind of wine outfit that really attracts people who love geeky wines that still manage to taste classic in the glass. Thirdly and finally, while Olifantsberg makes some incredible Chenin Blancs as well as lighter styled Grenaches, Syrahs, and like today's Pinotage, it's worth saying that their real unique selling point is their superb little patch of Roussanne vines. From these vines, Elisme Visser has crafted not only one of the country's very, very few Roussanne-backed white blends called the Matriarch, which is absolutely superb, but she also delivers a far more rare but equally worth hunting down cultivar bottling of Olifantsberg Roussanne. In the past, I have outlined 2 fairly disparate classes of Pinotage. there's the big, rich, ripe, highly extracted, heavily oaked, 15% alcohol, icon-style Pinotage. And usually, these are the ones that fill 9 out of 10 of the spots in South Africa's top 10 Pinotage awards each year. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the slightly more contrarian, geeky, super early harvest, high acid, light bodied, aromatic, Pinotage Nouveau style, meant to be drunk young, that makes wine nerds rejoice and bankers recoil. But I would argue that there is a third category which goes straight down the middle, and I'd say it's, economically speaking, more important than either of the two extremes. And this is the medium bodied, medium alcohol style Pinotage that is ripe enough to express the Pinotage character, but not so ripe that you lose all of that elegance and poise that you would hope for, given that its parents are Pinot Noir and Cinsault. So when we get into the glass, it may not be surprising for you to learn that today we have one of those Pinotages that sits in that lovely middle category. Now, when we give it a sniff, well, to be honest, it's not enormously extroverted, but the nose is quite complex. The Vanguard is fairly savory, and what we have up front is a kind of red licorice hint, followed by just a touch of that cured meat, which we often associate with Pinotage. But then there is the fresher stuff as well. One picks up lovely red cherry fruit, some pomegranate, and finally even an ever so subtle hint of sort of florally, herby lavender in there. And when we give this guy a sip, well, it's the texture that strikes first, because it has a lovely, fairly silky entry. But then very quickly you have this juicy, elegant acidity that climbs really quickly, revealing notes of sort of sour cherry and raspberry. But there are sweeter notes in there as well. In fact, there's a sherbet element and a sort of candied cherry note. And this makes total sense, because this is a wine that was made with 100% whole berry fermentation. Now, that's not whole bunch fermentation, where you have the green stems in the wine, and from that you'll get certain elements of spice and herbal and green notes and tannins. But this has got whole berry, so you get carbonic fermentation in the berries to a certain extent, without the spice and grip and greenness that sometimes comes from stems. Now, it's from those carbonic notes that you get the sherbet and the candy and the mention. But having said all that, this wine is by no means a tutti frutti affair. I mentioned up front that hint of salinity or savoriness on the nose, and really on the palate, that carries through and winds its way through those red fruit and candy notes. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. But if you have any more questions about Olifantsberg, first of all, watch the videos that I've left links to. Second of all, leave a note on the website and I will do my best to get back to you. And if you really enjoyed what we do here, then consider supporting us on Patreon so that we can produce more of these sorts of videos. And subscribe to the Handling Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month that talk about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African wine bins.